Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast. Now, today's episode is actually a repost of episode 495, which is one of the most popular episodes of the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast that I've ever published. And there's two reasons why I'm reposting it today. One is that it contains some really important information for all anglers. It can help you to find fish no matter where you are, because it's all about indicators. It's all about environmental signs and factors that can tell you where the fish are and what they're doing, so you can know what to cast at them and how to approach them. I'm sure that's why this episode has been so popular in the first place. The second reason that I'm reposting this episode today is it's actually being sponsored by the Urban Beats Deft Flicker Travel Rod. Now, the Urban Beats Deft Flicker Travel Rod is brought into Australia by a company called Jabbers Australia. If you haven't heard of them, well, trust me, you're going to hear a lot more about them in the very near future, because Jabbers are bringing into Australia what I reckon are some of the most innovative and versatile rods that you'll find anywhere. And these are all travel rods. They're all 5-piece rods that can be packed down into little cases 45, 50 centimeters long and taken just about anywhere with you. And you know, dinosaurs like me used to frown upon travel rods because the more pieces, the more potential places a rod can break, right? But that's not the case these days. In fact, these Urban Beats Deft Flicker rods are super tough, super resilient. They are absolutely not toys. They are top-notch fishing weapons. And yet they're not overly expensive. There's definitely cheaper rods on the market, but in terms of value for money, you would be very, very hard-pressed to beat this line of rods. The Jabbers have a rod that suits pretty much every angler, but the one that I've been using lately is the Urban Beats Deft Flicker, as I said earlier on. And it's an absolute delight to use. It's lightweight, it's responsive, it casts like a dream. It's just a really nice piece of kit, but what it's done for me is enabled me to keep my skills sharp. And this is where it fits in with today's episode, because what you'll find is you start looking for fish indicators. You'll find that you can't turn it off, right? My wife always marvels that anywhere we go, if we're near water, I'll spot fish, or I'll spot somewhere where there's likely to be fish. And I can't help myself. That's just how I've trained myself. I'm constantly looking for fish and for fishing opportunities. Now, the beautiful thing about the Urban Beats Deft Flicker rod is that when you see those opportunities, you can be prepared for them because they're packed down so small, they're so compact, they're tough, they're durable. You can put them under the seat of your car, you can put it in your work bag, you can leave one in the office even, you know, and it just makes it possible to have a fish anytime at the drop of a hat, whether it's during your lunch break or during the daily commute or whatever it might be. You see an opportunity to have a cast, you can have a cast. That keeps your skills sharp, it helps you to keep in touch with what's going on in the water, helps you to understand fish, and the more time you spend on the water, the better you're going to get at fishing, as simple as that. So the Urban Beats Deft Flicker, absolutely brilliant for that. It just opens up all these opportunities for these little micro fishing trips all over the place. But I'll tell you what, if I'm totally honest with you, this thing is so good that I find myself picking this rod up first off the rack, even when I'm going on a weekend fishing trip or an extended fishing trip. I find the Deft Flicker is often my rod of choice. It's great for skipping lures under mangroves for mangrove jack. It enables you to present with a great deal of finesse. It enables you to feel what's going on at the other end of your line, but it's got tons of grunt, when you hook a decent fish. And that's really important because this is a perfect rod for casting at school dew and rat kingfish and, river barramundi, decent Murray cod and so on. And, I'm talking fish here in the 80, 90, 100 centimetre sort of range, but you know that any time you're out targeting fish of that sort of size class, there's always a possibility that meter 10, meter 20, meter 30 fish might jump on board. And this might not be the first rod you'd choose to target those bigger fish, but it's got plenty of backbone. If you do hook one of those big fish, you've got a pretty good chance of being able to get it boat side or on the bank. So it's certainly not going to limit your options too much. So as you listen to this episode, I want you to think about those times when you're out on the water or you're out near the water, maybe not even with fishing in your mind, and you see those opportunities. You see these indicators that we're going to be talking about in today's episode that tell you this is a great opportunity to catch a fish. It's a great opportunity. There's going to be fish here, right? I can see, because these things are all aligned, that there's a very, very high likelihood of some quality fishing right here. And then I want you to think about how often that happens when you're not prepared for a fishing trip. And that's where this Urban Beats Deft Flicker rod comes in. And speaking of opportunities, guys, I have done a deal with Jabbers Australia. These guys are absolute legends. As I said, they're bringing in some amazing gear that I'm using more and more and more. But I've done a deal with them to be able to offer Australian Lure Fishing Podcast listeners an Urban Beats Deft Flicker rod bundled up with a bunch of lures and tackle that I keep in my car that I take with me when I'm traveling so that I can always take a roadside stop or go for a lunchtime fish or whatever it might be. So I call it my grab and go kit because it's there. I just pick it up as I'm walking out the door and I've got everything I need, as I said. And you can have the same grab and go kit that I use. The Urban Beats Deaf Licker Rod and a whole bunch of lures that are hand selected to enable me to be able to pick this kit up without really thinking about it and know that I've got everything I need 90% of the time when I'm by the water, that if I see some fish busting up or I see some sign that there's an opportunity there, I can just jump in and take advantage of that. Now, if you don't have something like that in your own range, you don't have a grab and go setup that's ready every time you leave the house, then it's highly likely you're missing a lot of opportunities. And I'd encourage you to just go and check out what we've put together over at doclures.com/deft, D-E-F-T, doclures.com/DEFT. Right, go and check it out. Just see what we've put together. And even if you don't buy what we've put together, put something together for yourself that's going to enable you to do exactly what I do and take advantage of all those micro fishing trips and micro fishing opportunities that'll keep your skills sharp. And not only that, they'll help your mental health as well, because you're getting these little breaks through the week that just give you a little bit of time out, enable you to become grounded and centered and ready to face whatever life throws at you. Anyway, folks, let's jump into this repost of episode 495 and get our heads around those indicators that tell us when and where to fish. Well, good morning, ALF listeners, and welcome to another episode of the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast. And I reckon this is quite an important episode for many people. It's all about how to find fish. And we've had conversations over the past 494 episodes about how to find fish, different species in different locations. And I've talked at times about different ways, different strategies you might use for finding fish when you're out on the water. But today what I'm going to do is talk about 10 indicators that a lot of people overlook. People don't, they might be glued to their sounder or they might be headed straight to a mark that they know and they overlook these indicators. But if you overlook them, you're doing so at your peril, because part of being a well-rounded angler, part of what makes the most successful anglers successful is that they identify when they're out on the water those indicators that are telling them something about what's going on beneath the water. And so that's what we're going to do today. 10 ways for you to know whether you're fishing in the right place based on what you can observe around you. So here we go with episode 495.
This is the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast, where we share the secrets of Australia's lure fishing gurus every Monday, Wednesday and Friday. And now here's your host, Greg Vinall from doclures.com.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to episode 495 of the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast. I'm your host, Greg Doclures Vinall, and my job is to help you catch more fish on lures, usually by bringing a guest on board, but sometimes by doing a bit of a solo rant like I'm doing today. Now, as I said at the start, what we're going to focus on today is 10 indicators that will tell you whether or not there's likely to be fish in the location that you're fishing. And these are 10 indicators that you can use whether you're fishing off the shore, whether you're fishing from a kayak, whether you're in a boat, whether you're on the ocean, whether you're in an estuary, on a lake. It really doesn't matter. These are common indicators, things that you need to be aware of, things that you need to tune into when you're on the water. Because like everyone, I love my marine electronics. You know that I do sonar masterclasses for Navico, and we help people to understand how to use their sonar in particular, but more generally their marine electronics. I love understanding how to use charts better. I love understanding how to use sonar, side scan, all the various options, electronics options that are available to us these days, because they can really enhance your fishing. And of course, not to mention trolling motors and all that kind of stuff. But back in the good old days, I'm starting to sound like my grandfather here, but back in the good old days, before we had all those electronics, the top anglers had to get by understanding how to find fish. And they'd use things like triangulation to put themselves roughly in the right spot. But then they'd read the water, they'd understand, they'd see the indicators that would tell them where the fish are likely to be and how they're behaving. Now, our best anglers still do that today. Even though they've got the marine electronics, they also use the indicators on the water. Really, really important. But that's our top anglers. That's our elite guys who are winning tournaments, who are guiding people to catch amazing sport fish, get their trophy fish and all that kind of stuff. And I've definitely noticed a tendency for anglers who are less experienced and probably not in the 10% group that are catching 90% of the fish to rely more heavily on the marine electronics to the exclusion of some of those environmental factors that they really should be tuned into. And I guess when you've got a chart plotter that's saying, here's a mark where there used to be fish or where there were fish once, or here's a nice piece of structure, and you've got sonar and you can see beneath the water surface and know whether there's fish or bait present, I guess it can tend to make us a little bit lazy. So we might just go to that mark, have a quick sound around and start fishing. Whereas what I've observed amongst the elite anglers in the country is that they're very much looking also at those environmental factors. So I want to bring up today 10 factors that you should be aware of, 10 things that you should notice when you're on the water. So take your eyes off the sounder for a little bit and look for these things. And if you see them, they're going to tell you a bit about whether the fish are likely to be there and also how the fish might be behaving on a particular set of conditions or circumstances. Now, in previous episodes, we've talked about the importance of having marks, but also the importance of recognizing that a mark is just somewhere where there used to be fish or there used to be bait or there might be a nice piece of structure, and that marks might fish differently on different tides or different winds or different environmental conditions. So these factors that I'm going to talk about today will help you to decide which of the marks you have in your sounder are worth fishing. And if you're fishing from the shore or if you're fishing from a kayak and you don't have a sounder, you're using your eyes and your ears and all of your senses to try and find fish, well, these are some of the things that are going to help you to do that. So I'll go through this list. As I said, there are 10 items here that I'm going to talk about. They're not in any particular order of importance, okay? It's a random order of importance, so don't think the thing that comes up as the number one on the list is necessarily the most important or vice versa. I'm going to start with bait because it's one of the things that most people these days are kind of aware as a good indicator of fish. So we've all heard the saying, find the bait and you'll find the fish. Anywhere there's bait, you'll find predators. And that's why we often hear people telling stories about going out to the bait grounds if they're fishing offshore, and they'll be jigging up some live baits and they'll be watching people catch their live baits and then go way out over the horizon looking for a reef or looking for a current line or looking for somewhere to fish, when quite often the fish that they're actually looking for can be found at the bait grounds because the bait are there, and so it brings the fish to that area. Now, there are lots of different ways that we can observe bait, but one of the things that I'd like you to consider is whether the bait are actually being worried or not, because the saying, find the bait and you'll find the fish, is all very well, but there are occasions where you'll find bait that don't have fish on them at that particular point in time. That, the fish obviously could turn up and start worrying that bait school, but they might not be there at that particular time. And there is the potential that you'll fish a bait school that has no predators on it when you'd be better off to move to somewhere where there are predators. So it's a bit of a catch-22. I'm having an each way bet here by saying, where you find the bait, quite often there are predatory fish around, but you still need to make some observations. You still need to keep your eyes and your ears open, be thinking, and if obviously you're not seeing any sign of predators and you're not catching any fish at that location despite there being bait there, you might need to go and find another place where there's bait or another piece of structure where there are predatory fish. And I know I said that, we were going to be looking at environmental factors that required you to take your eyes off the sounder screen for a moment. But just for just a moment, we will talk about looking at the sounder when you're looking for bait, because obviously for anyone who has a boat and has the electronics, that's a primary way to find bait. Obviously, when you find bait on your sounder, it could be a school of baitfish, it could be a school of prawns, it could be anything that your target species might be feeding on. You want to be observant about how that bait appears on your sounder screen. So if it appears tightly packed, if the sounder screen comes up red, you've got a dense patch in the middle of the bait ball and you can see arches around, or even if you can't see arches around, that densely packed ball of bait tends to indicate there might be predators nearby, because as predators approach a school of baitfish, all of the baitfish band together and every baitfish tries to get to the middle where it feels safer from predation and not be on the outside edges where you might get eaten. And so it's usually a good indication if the bait are tightly packed, and especially if you can see kind of straight, flat sections on the bait, because as a predator swims close to a bait ball, those baitfish try and move away and they get tightly packed around the edges. So you finish up with sharp, square, straight edges on the bait ball instead of a fuzzy round mass. So those are good indications that you might have bait that's being harassed by predators, and obviously it's a good place to fish. But let's take our eyes back off the sounder for a moment, because you can observe bait fish and you can observe schools of prawns and you can observe things that will tell you that there's bait around without using a sounder. And if you think about, perhaps we'll use the example of kayak fishing in an estuary. you might see prawns flicking in shallows. Now, we know that creatures like prawns in an aquatic environment, they live a pretty scary life. Everything's trying to eat them. They're favourite food of just about every species, and they're not going to come up to the surface. They're not going to expose themselves. They're not going to give away their location unless they're a bit worried, unless something's chasing them. So anytime you see prawns or baitfish or whatever, even if it's just a single flick, you might see it up in the shallows or around a piece of structure or something like that. It's a good indication that there might be something chasing that prawn, and that prawn is trying to escape, and part of the strategy is to break the water surface and scoot along where it might be harder for the fish to see them. But in so doing, they've given you a very good sign that there might be a predatory fish around. Now, I've used prawns in estuaries as an example, but you can take this to dams. If you're kayak fishing in a dam and you see shrimp or you see bait species, bony bream or something like that, flicking, if you see what we call nervous water, which is where a school of baitfish is pushed up on the surface and they're causing the water to ripple. Really obvious on a calm day if you get a patch of rippled water that it might be baitfish up near the surface, but you can see them on less calm days as well at times. Anytime baitfish are jumping out of the water, all good signs that they're being pursued by a predator. And the same applies to rivers. The same applies whether you're fishing coastal inlets and even offshore. You can see these signs that there might be predators worrying bait. And I've seen in the offshore environment, baitfish packed so tightly into balls that there's actually, on a flat, calm, oily day, it's like this little mound on the water surface. They're packed in so tight that they cause the water to mound up over the top of them. And so you can see these little tiny little lumps all over the sea surface where there are schools of baitfish, and in this particular instance, they were being harassed by spotted and school mackerel, but it could be any predatory species. So bait is always a good sign, and that's where I've started. That's number one, and it's probably the one that most people know really well, but I just want to reiterate, having bait present is a great sign. It's a really, really good sign. But if you spend some time at a location where there's bait and the bait are scattered, they're not balled up, there's no sign of predators, there's no arches coming up on your sounder, you're not seeing bait flicking on the surface, then it's bait that's having a very nice, casual, relaxed day and isn't being predated upon, and you can probably move on and fish somewhere else. But note the location of that bait and come back, because it may well be that later on the tidal cycle, or when the weather, the wind changes direction or something else in the environment changes, that the fish may move in on that bait and start to feed. Okay, so the second way that you can get a pretty good idea there might be some fish around the area is by watching the birds. And I guess most anglers these days are aware, if you're offshore, you're looking for particular bird species that are diving, that are bombing, that are wheeling, that are working the water surface, because that's an indication that there's a predator nearby. It's an indication that bait might be pushed to the surface. And so those birds are a great signal. You can see them from a long way away. They're a great signal that there might be some predatory fish around. But I want you to think more broadly about birds. And over the course of 495 episodes of the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast, you've heard numerous people talk about birds in numerous environments. It's not just limited to the offshore environment. So birds working in estuaries or coastal inlets, that can be a pretty good indication that there's perhaps tailor or salmon or something like that working over bait schools. And beneath those tailor or salmon, there might be jewfish, or there might be other species that you want to target. So birds working is a really obvious sign of fish being around, or, a high likelihood of fish being around, I guess. And we could probably do a whole episode on understanding bird species and, what birds look like when they're working, what they look like when they're searching, and what that tells you about what the fish might be doing. But there's more subtle indicators of fish that are given to us by birds as well. So a lot of people overlook the importance of birds as indicators of fish in freshwater areas and estuaries. So pelicans are a great example. The presence of a number of pelicans, whether they're in the water feeding or even if they're just standing along the bank, lining the bank, that's a pretty good indication that there's either baitfish nearby or that they're expecting baitfish to be nearby. And so it's a good indication there might be predatory fish not too far away either. And I know as a kid we'd be fishing and the pelicans would come along and we'd all pack up and go because we thought the pelicans would be scaring away the fish. Well, that's not the case. Pelicans are a good indicator that there's likely to be fish around, although you do have to factor in, the concept that pelicans do, like lots of species, they do tend to recognize that there might be an easy feed sometimes when there are human beings around. So in some instances, the pelicans might be around, particularly around boat ramps and that sort of thing, where they think they might be able to get a few fish scraps where somebody's cleaning their fish. So just be aware of that. But if you're motoring along in your boat, if you're paddling along in your kayak, if you're driving along looking for a place to fish land-based and you see pelicans, then that's a good sign. And likewise, other bird species like cormorants and waders. I mean, these are birds that cormorants feed on baitfish, the same baitfish that our target species are likely to be feeding on. Wading birds like heron and egrets, they feed a lot on crustaceans and small fish. Again, if there's lots of wading birds around, that's a good indication there might be bait around, or is likely to be bait around at some phase of the tide or some stage during the day. Sea eagles is another one. If you see sea eagles and ospreys, that's a good indication. I mean, those guys know where fish are because they make a living from catching fish, right? So places near where there are sea eagle nests or where you see sea eagles perched, they're a good place to fish. And places where wading birds and fish-eating birds tend to perch above the water, they're also good places to fish. And we've heard examples of catching sooty grunter beneath trees where the cormorants sit because they're feeding on what the cormorants drop. That's another good example of using birds, I guess, to identify places where there might be fish. So definitely birds are our friends. In any way, shape or form, if you see birds, water birds around, birds that feed on fish or crustaceans or shellfish, anything like that, that's a good sign. Okay, so let's move on to indicator number 3. And I'm going to lump two animals together here that are in no way related, but turtles and dugong. Now, turtles and dugong are both indicators that there's some kind of seagrass around. They feed on seagrass, they feed on algae, they feed on jellyfish. All of those environmental factors, they're all things that indicate the potential for baitfish and the potential for habitat and structure that holds predatory fish. So people often overlook turtles. You see them out in the marine environment, particularly if you're in the northern half of Australia, you'll see turtles on a fairly regular basis. You know that if there are a large number of turtles working, that you're on a reef system that is productive. You know that they're there for a reason. They're there because there's food for them, and that food is a result of algal growth. That algal growth is a result of nutrients. Those same nutrients feed the zooplankton. They feed the phytoplankton. They feed the krill. They feed a whole range of small food items, small fish, of course, that are eaten by predatory fish. So if you're motoring around, you're paddling around, you're walking around and you see turtles or you see dugong, that's a good indication that there might be some fish in the vicinity, a good place to start paying some attention. Now, in freshwater systems, it's much the same. You have to consider that, our reptilian friends, the freshwater turtles, no dugongs, obviously, in our lake systems, or none that I'm aware of. Would be an interesting find, wouldn't it, to find a dugong in a lake or a river? But turtles, certainly, they feed in the same way as every other animal. They go to places where there's lots of food around. Freshwater turtles tend to be omnivorous, so the fact that they're around a particular area, that there are large numbers of them in a particular area, is a good indication that there's some food items there for them. Those food items can be crustaceans, they can be freshwater shellfish, they can be plant material, but all of those things are also food and habitat for baitfish, and they're food and habitat for our target species. So if you see signs of life in the form of turtles or dugongs, or in freshwater, the freshwater species of turtles, that's always worth stopping and having a bit of a look around and trying to figure out what might be going on in that area. Okay, so indicator number 4, and this is one for our Northern Australian estuary fishers, is crocodiles. Now, we're all aware that crocodiles are in our systems. They're probably treated with a bit of disdain. There are anglers out there that love to see them. There are anglers out there that hate crocodiles and dread seeing them and would love to see them culled. I tell you what, I like seeing crocodiles when I'm chasing barramundi, mangrove jack, or threadfin salmon, because those species are the favourite food of crocodiles. If there are crocodiles in an area, that means that there's food in that area, and they do like to target the barramundi in particular, but also the threadies and the mangrove jack. So finding a place where crocodiles congregate, that's a good indication that there's a food source, and it's worth spending some time exploring and seeing if you can find some fish there. So moving on now to indicator number 5, and this is one that applies all around Australia in saltwater areas, and it's sharks and dolphins. Now, I might make myself a little bit unpopular by saying this. Sharks, they're the talk of the town at the moment. Sharks are eating human beings. They're stealing fish off lines. They seem to be in prolific numbers and doing a lot of damage to recreational fisheries. But the fact that sharks are around is a good indication that there's fish around. And like the pelicans, where I said, they have become a bit habituated. They kind of know that where there's humans, there might be a free feed. Sharks are a little bit the same. And one of the reasons that we see so many sharks and we lose so many fish to sharks is that they do recognize the sound of a boat. They do recognize that when a boat is anchored up over a reef or, spot locked over a wonky hole or fishing in an estuary somewhere, that the sharks recognize that there's something going on there. They know that if they hang around, don't expend too much energy, sooner or later, a very tired fish is going to present itself, be just about have just about no chance of escaping a predatory shark that's going to come and snip it off behind the head. So that's a little bit frustrating for sure, and we need to be aware that that this is a bit of an issue at the moment for recreational anglers. We need to be very cautious also about staying on a spot where there are sharks, and I normally would recommend to people, if you stay at a wonky hole, for example, you get 1 or 2 fish and then the sharks turn up, it's time to move to the next wonky hole. It's time to move to the next patch of reef and move away from the sharks, because you're not going to get a fish past a shark, and all you're doing is wiping out the school of fish by bringing them up and allowing the sharks to eat them, frustrating yourself and wasting time. You may as well go and find another spot, hopefully get another couple of fish before the sharks turn up, and then move again. And unfortunately, that's just the way things are at times, particularly in the part of the world where I live in North Queensland. It's the talk of the town, is the issue with sharks. But as I say, the fact that there are sharks around, they are there for a reason. Now, if you're seeing sharks, if you haven't started fishing, if you're not anchored, you're not on spot lock, you haven't been burling up or anything crazy like that, and there are no other boats around and you're seeing sharks, well, then that's an indication that there's something there that those sharks want to eat. And unlike some of the other indicators, we're talking about birds, they're feeding on baitfish that our target species will eat. Well, sharks tend to feed on our target species as well as the baitfish. So the fact that there are big predators like sharks, and in fact dolphins as well, in a particular area means that there's plenty of food there for them. And since they like those bigger morsels, quite likely it's going to be some of the bigger species we might be targeting. So sharks are a good sign. They're also very much a pain in the butt. And I'm going to leave it there and not talk too much more about that. All right, so this is probably a good time to pause and just reflect back, because what I've discussed so far have all been kind of biological indicators, I guess. So we've had bait, we've had birds, we've had turtles and dugongs, we've had crocodiles, we've had sharks and dolphins. So the 5 indicators that I've talked about so far have all been animals that indicate to us that there might be some activity, that we might be in a productive area. Hey folks, hope you're enjoying this repost of episode 495. Now we're about to move into those non-biological indicators that we should all familiarise ourselves with and condition ourselves to notice even when we're not actively fishing, because they're going to reveal to us those fishing opportunities. Before we do that though, just a reminder that as you start to identify these fishing opportunities and you start to see them more and more, you're going to want to be prepared to take advantage of them. And that's what my grab and go fishing system's all about. So it's that Urban Beats Deft Flicker travel rod, a bunch of lures that I've handpicked that I personally take everywhere I go because I know they'll cover most fishing scenarios. There's rigging gear, there's tutorials, there's memberships, there's a whole bunch of stuff bundled together in this grab and go fishing system. And you can grab this system for yourself and be ready to fish anywhere you find yourself by going over to doclures.com/deft, D-E-F-T, doclures.com/DEFT. Now, if you're an urban dweller and you're looking forward to that next trip away to central Queensland to the lakes or the Great Barrier Reef or down south to Tassie or whatever it might be, this is the kit that will help you to keep your skills sharp the whole time. So you're not having to wait for that next trip away. When you hit the water on your big fishing trip, your casting's already dialed in, your skills are at their peak, and you're ready to take advantage of that fishing trip of a lifetime. Because nothing worse than going on this much anticipated fishing trip and spending the first half of the trip retrieving lures from snags and trees and all sorts of things because you haven't managed to maintain your skills because you don't live somewhere where fishing is easily accessible to you. This grab and go system will get around that by giving you the opportunity to grab these little micro fishing trips that not only keep your fishing skills sharp, they also keep you sane because you get these little breaks now and then from the daily grind to just go and wet a line and reconnect with nature, I guess. And then on top of all that, this is a system that enables you to present with finesse to educated, smart urban fish at sea. A lot of lures can be very difficult to tempt. This system is absolutely perfect for them. Now, if you're using this system in that urban setting and you head off somewhere to a wilderness fishing destination, I guarantee you, if you can catch fish in an urban environment, you can absolutely catch fish out in a wilderness environment. So make the most of every fishing opportunity. Go and check out my Doc Lures grab and go fishing system at doclures.com/deft. But now, folks, let's pick up from where we left off and find out those other 5 indicators, the non-biological indicators that will help us to identify when and where to fish every time we're near the water. What I'd like to do now is talk more about some of the environments and some of the habitats. So indicator number 6 is all about the health of the ecosystem kind of generally. So if you're, and let's use a freshwater example here, if you're on a river system and the banks look sick, if the vegetation's dying off, if it just looks like an unhealthy system, you can see it's been, there's lots of pollution coming in. You can see that there's rubbish along the banks, along the shorelines, all that kind of stuff. If you can see things floating in the water that shouldn't be floating in the water, and the general health of the system looks pretty poor, then the odds are the water quality is also going to be poor. The odds are that it's not going to be great habitat for fish. Now, there are exceptions. And certainly those who fish our urban areas know there are places where, litter might accumulate because the wind pushes it there, but it's also pushing other food items there. And sadly, in amongst all that plastic waste and all the rubbish that's floating around on the surface and even subsurface, there might be some quality fish. But generally speaking, if a waterway looks sick, if the banks look like there's no sign of life, you're not seeing lizards, you're not seeing wallabies, you're not seeing any kind of life there, then generally what you see above the water also extends down beneath the water. And I guess the converse of that is also true, that if you come into an area where you see really healthy, diverse plant life, where you see really healthy, diverse terrestrial animals, then quite often that extends beneath the water surface. And I'm reflecting back on a conversation I had with Nigel Webber about fishing in billabongs on Cape York, and he was fishing places that looked like they should be great. They had lots of habitat, they had lots of structure that should hold barramundi and other species, but they didn't. And what he noticed was every time they found a little bay or a little area where there were signs of life on land, such as birds and lizards and snakes and rats and all those sorts of things, that usually there was also bait and there was also fish in that area as well. So the overall health of the system, look for places where there's vegetation overhanging banks. So you've got shade, you've got things falling out of the vegetation. I mean, if you're fishing for species like Saratoga, species like Australian bass, some of those species that love to feed on the surface and that are always looking for insects or lizards or anything that falls out of vegetation. Well, obviously having overhanging vegetation is not only going to provide a food source, it's also going to provide shade, which stops the water from getting too warm during the hot months. It stops the fish's eyes from becoming hurt by bright sunlight. It gives them advantage in being able to ambush prey that comes into the shade and all sorts of things. So terrestrial health and any kinds of healthy signs of healthy life on the shore, that's a good indication that you might be fishing in a good spot where there should hopefully be some good healthy signs of life beneath the surface as well. So this brings me to indicator number 7. And indicator number 7 is about currents and structure. And by here I'm talking about structure that you can see without your sounder, although you could apply this equally to structure that you can see with your sounder. If you're on, if you're on a boat and you're looking at a screen, this kind of stuff still applies. So I guess I would preface the discussion about this particular indicator by saying that fish are always, like human beings, always looking for comfort. Okay, and currents, water movement, you've all heard the saying, if there's no run, there's no fun. And in many instances that's true, not always, but in many instances, places where there's current or times of day when there's current or tides tend to produce more fish than places or times of day where there's not much water movement. And there's a really good reason for that, because moving water doesn't become stagnant. Water that's moving tends to pick up oxygen, so it tends to be well oxygenated. it tends to be a bit more moderate in temperatures. It doesn't get as hot, doesn't get as cold. Water that is moving tends to bring food to the fish. So for a fish that's looking for comfort, here you've got, you know which way your food's coming from, and you can face into the current and wait for it. And you've got, temperatures, and you've got oxygen concentrations that tend to suit you. And so that works really well. The problem with that, of course, is that if you have a current that you have to swim against, then you're constantly expending energy just to stay in one place. So fish like the combination of current and structure. And places where current strikes structure, where the current is interrupted by structure, are always good places to look for fish. And in fact, a big part of the pre-trip planning stuff that I've been teaching my Team Doc Lures guys, and if you're interested in becoming part of this and learning this stuff firsthand, then please go and check out Team Doc Lures at team.doclures.com. But one of the things that we've been doing is breaking down systems and having a look at them based on tides and based on wind and based on current and recent past conditions, and highlighting some spots where fish are likely to have aggregated and congregated based on the structure that's around. So if you're fishing in lakes, rivers, estuaries, or coastlines, points and headlands are always good places to start, because points and headlands interrupt currents, and they also interrupt the movement of bait species. So bait species tend to move along a shoreline, and when they come to a point, they all tend to have to congregate to get past that point. So it's a good ambush place for predatory fish, is on the point of any lake, river, estuary, or coastal area. But, if you've got wind blowing from one direction on a lake or along a piece of inshore coastline, then you've got wind-driven currents that are pushing in a particular direction. And if you know where to look, you'll know that the fish are going to be around those points where the wind currents have been broken or have been disrupted, I guess, by a piece of hard structure. And that might be, a shallow sloping point that's got some weed on it. Or it might be a hard rocky headland that's got some boulders and stuff strewn around. It might be submerged trees or whatever on a point that are going to interrupt that current flow. So it's never a bad thing to spend some time looking at maps and looking at satellite imagery and thinking about currents and winds and tides and those sorts of things, and figuring out where those pinch points, they're called, or pressure points, those places where currents get interrupted, might be before you get on the water. But once you're on the water, then you need to use your eyes and your ears and figure out where the fish might be. So you can create marks by having a look at maps and charts before you leave home. Once you get there, you need to start thinking about, what's actually happening here? And it's not always easy to see current. Sometimes it is. I mean, if you're fishing sand flats, for example, you're watching the tide start to ebb, the tide's starting to run out. You can see the water running into the channels, into the drains around those sand flats. You can see where the water moves, the path that it takes, and you know where the fish are going to be lying in ambush. On many of our estuary systems and our coastal embayments and our coastal inlets, from the south of Australia right up to the north, you can see when the tide's running out. You can see the current running. You can see those pieces of structure that are being hit by current, because you get ripples on the surface. You get current lines. You get indications. If there's a rock bar or a reef or a sand flat or something beneath the surface, you can see ripples on the water surface. You can see patches of smooth water. So all of those kind of tell us a little bit about what's going on with currents, and they all indicate that the currents have hit something. It's created turbulence. That's stirring up food. It's oxygenating water. It's always a good place to spend some time. But it even works offshore. I mean, you can see offshore on one of those oily, calm days, if you've got a strong current flowing, you can see patches of water that are rippled. You can see where there's an upwelling. You can see current lines. I mean, a really good indication, whether you're inshore or offshore, or even on estuaries, you can see things like little pieces of flotsam and jetsam on the surface. You can see a line of rippled water on one side and smooth water on the other side. And you can see all this flotsam and jetsam floating around. That's a good indication there's a current running through there, but that current is running at two speeds. You've got an area where there's turbulence. You've got an area where the current's flowing more smoothly, or maybe there isn't so much current. You can look for eddies where the current's flowing in different directions within a pretty close range. So if you've got current running down a river system, for example, and you've got a little embayment, then the water tends to circulate and eddy in that embayment. That's an area where the current is less strong. It's an area where food gets carried and trapped, and it's an area where predatory fish quite often are going to be waiting. So the saying, there's no run, there's no fun, as I said, quite often true, but it's not necessarily true if you don't have a piece of structure. If you're in a place where the current's just ripping through, it's flowing full pace, and there's nothing to interrupt that current, there's nothing to create a pressure point, there's nothing to create an ambush point, there's nothing to create a little bit of cover that the fish can use as a current break, then currents might be a bad thing. I mean, another good example, if you think about river systems, a large boulder in a river system creates a patch of quiet water just in front of the boulder. So species like trout will tend to sit in that little eye, I guess I'd call it, that pressure point in front of a boulder where they don't have to swim hard, but where they can see food coming down towards them. What a lot of people don't realize is the same thing happens in lakes. If you've got a log or a rock along a lake shoreline, you've got a wind blowing that's creating a current, then in the same way as the water current in a river gets disrupted by that rock, the water current in a lake gets disrupted by a rock as well. So people don't realize that there are currents in lakes and in embayments and in little inlets that are created by the wind, and that the fish, once again, are going to sit in front of that structure. They're going to sit where there's a break in the current where they can see food being washed towards them. So that's indicator number 7, currents. And I'd strongly recommend, if you don't do it already, that you spend some time before you head out fishing doing some research on what the past winds have been doing, what the tides are going to be doing, what the winds are going to be doing on the day, and figuring out those currents. Obviously, it's a little bit easier if you're fishing river systems where you've got constant flow, but definitely if you're fishing estuaries, lakes, any other system, coastal areas, offshore, you need to understand currents really well. Okay, so moving on to indicator number 8. This one's well known, particularly to our northern Australian anglers, and those who fish for barramundi during the runoff will be well aware of this one, but colour change is a really important thing. And I'm talking here mainly about water colour, but also not just colour change, but water quality more generally. So where you see two bodies of water that have different qualities, whether it be clarity or colour, and we kind of talk about those as though they're the same thing, but they're not. But if you've got water that's clear alongside of water that's turbid, then you've got this kind of two bodies of water, two masses of water that have different characteristics and different qualities, and fish quite often will be in there. Likewise, colour. And so here I'm thinking about water that's still clear, but it might be tannin stained. So you might have clear water, you might have tannin stained water. They're not cloudy, they're not turbid, they're different colours. But again, often fish will work along that junction between where those two bodies of water meet. Likewise, for those that like to fish offshore, you'll hear people who do a lot of blue water fishing talking about this. You'll have areas where there's green water meeting blue water. And you can see this on lakes and in freshwater systems as well. And even in small bays or quiet estuaries or places like that, you might see green water and clear water. Well, green water is an indication that there's algae in the system. In offshore areas, green water usually indicates it's chlorophyll, is the green pigment, the algal pigment that turns the water green. But green water offshore indicates that there's some kind of upwelling. It indicates that there's a current striking something and it's bringing nutrients to the top. And so you're getting a bloom of plankton near the top. That bloom of plankton feeds baitfish. That bloom of baitfish then feeds predatory fish. So a lot of people don't like to fish in the green water. They like to fish in the blue water, but others like to fish in the green water. And what you'll find is quite often fish will work along that line between the green and blue water. Now, sometimes it's a really distinct, sharp line, particularly if you've got a calm, still day. And sometimes it happens over a period of, maybe 100 metres or more that the water changes colour slowly. It doesn't really matter. What it's telling you is there's something going on there that's causing nutrients to come to the surface. There's something going on there that's increasing the productivity of the system, and that in turn is likely to attract fish. Now, whether they stay in the blue water and make forays into the green water to find food, or whether they hunt in the green water where they're hidden from predation doesn't really matter. Just know that where you change from green to blue, or where you change from tannin stained to clear, or where you change from muddy to clear, all of those are prime locations where you're likely to find fish. Now, in lake systems, and if you think about down south here, you'll hear people talking quite often about Murray cod fishing, about fishing for yellow belly, Australian bass, other species, and likewise up in the north, in the lakes up in northern Australia, you'll hear people talking about barramundi fishing, sooty grunter fishing, that kind of thing. Quite often where there's a colour change that's caused by wind blowing along a bank, or wind blowing into a bay, and so you get dirty water and clean water. Again, a great place to fish. Most of our predatory species will use that dirty water either to herd bait up or they'll use it to ambush bait. And that's why we find Murray cod in a foot or two of water along a shoreline. If there's a bit of a mud line where the water's been stirred up by strong winds or by wind-driven currents, you'll find cod in there. You'll find bass on the outside of that mud line quite often feeding on baitfish that they've herded into the dirty water. You'll find barramundi up north in that dirty water. If you like your threadfin salmon fishing in northern estuaries, you'll find them in the mudline where water's running out of drains, water's running off flats, and you get a change in water colour. So anywhere there's a change in water colour is definitely worth exploring more. And in fact, any change in water quality is worth exploring. If you've got two water masses that have different water quality. I mean, one of the things we've talked about is the fish's sense of smell and their ability to smell the different chemical makeup of water. This is how salmonids in the northern hemisphere find their way back into the creek where they were first spawned. They can actually smell the salts and the minerals and the fresh water coming down. They've got some other sense that gets them to the creek mouth, but it's the smell of the water and the smell of the different chemicals and minerals that allows them to find that creek from which they first originated. Now, predatory fish can use those same senses. So if you're thinking about particularly something like an estuary, but even a lake, even a river system where you've got a tributary coming in and you've got water coming, you've got a water body there and then you've got a tributary bringing water from a different source that has different mineralization, has different qualities, different pH, might have different organic material in it. Fish can smell that difference. And to go back to our example of runoff barra in Northern Territory and Northern Queensland estuaries, if you've got a tributary system coming in that's bringing fresh water from a billabong or a lagoon or a creek or whatever coming into an estuary system, barramundi that are moving from downstream or down current, if they're in a tidal system, towards that creek that's coming in can smell that fresh water coming in from quite a distance away. And they know before they even get there that there's a source of water coming in that's going to be bringing them food. So they're predisposed by the time they find that creek mouth to have a feed. And just backtracking, and I do apologize for jumping around a little bit, but backtracking to that green water, one of the things that happens in green water is that the algae that cause that coloration tend to photosynthesize during the day. So they're oxygenating the water around them. And then at night they tend to respire. So they're deoxygenating the water at night. And so there are other water quality factors at play there as well as color. And if you think about water that's high in oxygen, that tends to get fish a bit more mobile. It tends to get them a little bit more fired up. They've got a bit more energy. If they go into that green water at a phase when the oxygen is low, and the period when the oxygen is at its lowest tends to be first thing in the morning, just around about the time that the first light starts to hit the sky and the plankton start to photosynthesize again. But if they go into that green water before that, it's kind of like going into a room with no air. It's a bit hard to breathe. They're a bit lethargic, a bit doughy, and you might find that they tend to either not feed so much in the green water or they tend to stay out of the green water where they've got clean oxygenated water nearby, and they'll wait till later in the day and move in there. So be aware of different effects of water quality, whether it's clarity, whether it's chemical, whether it's oxygen and physicochemical type parameters like that, because all of those things affect what fish do and where they move and how they behave. And you need to be aware of that. You need to use your eyes. You need to observe, see what the fish are doing, see what the water quality is doing, and understand a little bit about how it affects them. Because everything beneath the water surface is affected by water chemistry and by water physicochemistry as well. Let me give you another example. This is not one that you can observe without your sounder, or at least not so easily. There are occasions where you can. But the changes in water quality that I've just talked about are horizontal changes, spatial changes. So a change in the color or a change in the turbidity or a change in the chemistry when you move from one place to another. You can be sitting in one place, and I'm talking here particularly about in deeper water bodies, estuaries, especially so, lakes definitely, and even offshore. You can have changes in water chemistry from the surface of the water down to the bottom. And the most common one that people are aware of is the thermocline, which is a term used to describe an area as you're going down, a vertical area where there's a rapid change in temperature. So the water above tends to be warmed by the sun, the water below is not getting sun, and you've got this short stretch of water. Maybe it's a meter, maybe it's 2 meters, maybe even 3 meters, but the water temperature can change dramatically over that period. And you can see it on a sounder because the colder water below is quite dense, The warmer water above is less dense. That's what causes the thermocline in the first place. So the warmer water is circulating above and the colder water is trapped beneath. But that shows up on your sounder because of the density differences, right? Your sounder picks up the difference in density between cold water and warm water. Another example is what's called a halocline. People are less familiar with this, and they probably tend to refer to it as a thermocline. It also appears on your sonar, if you're looking at your sonar screen, to look like a thermocline as well. And it's again because your sonar is picking up density changes. But what it's picking up here is a change in the salinity, or a change in the amount of dissolved salt in the water. So what happens is, in an estuary system, as an example, you might have seawater pushing in as the tide's running in. You've got seawater pushing in underneath. If you've had a rainfall event, you might have fresh water coming down the river system. And because the fresh water has less salt in it, it's less dense, it floats on top and the seawater sits beneath. And that area that changes from fresh water to seawater, where there's a rapid change in the amount of dissolved salts, that's called the halocline. Once again, that's a kind of piece of invisible structure. It's not invisible because you can see it on your sounder, but to the naked eye, it's invisible structure, happens at a particular depth, and fish quite often will use that halocline to feed. And you'll get marine fish coming in the salt water beneath. They'll duck up into the fresh water to grab morsels. You get freshwater fish moving down and living in the littoral zone along the river's edges where the water's fresh and feeding and the marine fish underneath. So I've seen places where you can catch river trout and you can catch bream from the same environment. The bream are in the salt water beneath, the trout are feeding along the river's edges, and that's because of this halocline that forms. There's also a thing called an oxycline, and that can happen whenever you've got a thermocline or a halocline and your dissolved oxygen can change. So anyway, the point I'm making is these are changes in the water chemistry, and they dictate how fish behave in our lakes, in our estuaries, in our coastal embayments and inlets, and of course out in the ocean as well. So I reckon that's enough said about that. So that's indicator number 8. It's water quality, water colour, and things like salinity and temperature and dissolved oxygen and that sort of thing, and how they affect fish behaviour. And you really need to understand and observe those and figure out how they affect your target species. Indicator number 9 for me is edges. And this is a really good one that you can do some research at home on Google Earth. You can do some research looking at, a bathymetric app like Navionics or CMAPS or something like that. You can do this once you get out on the water, is look for edges. Now, what do I mean by edges? Well, I guess in some ways, the indicator that we just talked about, that water chemistry and colour change one, that's kind of about edges as well. It's areas where, there's a change in the chemistry. But when I talk about edges, I'm talking more about physical structure. Because I've had a couple of guests that have made the statement, if you watch a rat run through a barn, it never goes through the middle of the room, it goes along the wall. It follows an edge, it follows a crack, it follows some piece of structure. And fish tend to do the same thing. So when I talk about edges, I'm talking about things like changes in the substrate from sand to mud, or from mud to rock, or from sand to seagrass or something like that. Anywhere there's an edge where two different types of substrate meet, it's kind of like a path that fish follow. It kind of helps them navigate, but it's also a place where they forage and hunt and feed. If you think about species that live in seagrass beds, for example, they often tend to be, they'll often be scattered right through the seagrass, but if you have a patch where there's a bit of a sandy patch or there's a bit of a rock, you'll often find there's higher concentrations of fish around that change in structure. The same if you're looking at bass, for example, in a freshwater storage. You might have massive areas of weed bed and there might be fish right in, and there probably is fish right in amongst that weed. But quite often they'll be working along either the inside edge between the weed bed and the shoreline, or they'll be working around the outside edge where there's deeper water, because they can follow those edges along, they can forage, and it kind of gives them a path to navigate and gives them a constant source of food as well. Now, sometimes those edges aren't as sharp and as delineated, I guess, as the edge of a weed bed like I've just described. To give an example, in inshore areas or even offshore areas, those who are fishing for snapper, often people make the mistake of sitting on top of a reef, because we all know that snapper love reefs, right? But typically the snapper will be on the edges of the reef. They like the rubbly areas, not actually right on top of the reef. And so that you're looking for transitional areas where it's going from a sandy substrate or a muddy substrate to rubbly and finally to reef. And the snapper quite often will be in that rubbly stuff just in front of the reef. And for our northern anglers, yeah, the same applies to things like finger mark bream and nanny guy and a lot of other species as well. They like to be in that rubbly stuff and not necessarily right in amongst the reef itself, although some species do like to be in the reef. But definitely edges of any kind are worth checking out. Another good example of an edge, of course, is a channel or a drain. If you're a bream fisher, you might find on the high tide, the bream will come up onto the flats and they'll feed over those yabby beds or those pippy beds or wherever there's lots of feed as the tide starts to recede. And the same can be said, I guess, of flathead and a whole bunch of other species as well. But as the tide starts to recede, you'll find that those fish tend to work their way along the channel edges, the drop-offs, right? So this is where there's a change in depth. So anywhere there's some kind of change or transitional zone seems to always attract fish. So spend a bit of time on Google Earth, spend a bit of time on Navionics or CMAPS or whatever your preferred app is, looking for places where there are transitional zones. When you're out on the water, when you're wading, when you're walking, when you're kayaking, when you're boating, keep your eyes open, look for edges that might indicate fish. And these things can shift, right? Weed beds shift as seasonal factors influence them. Sandbanks shift as currents influence them. So definitely be willing to adjust your strategy and check out new places when you identify those edges. If you're fishing in the middle of a sand bed, if you're fishing in the middle of a reef, if you're fishing in the middle of a weed bed, you will find fish there from time to time, but you're going to find more fish along those edges, along those transitional zones where things change. Unless, of course, you've got some kind of structure in the middle of that sandbank or in the middle of that reef or in the middle of that weed bed that's holding fish. And finally, that brings me to indicator number 10. And indicator number 10 is fish homes and fish highways. So to state the bleeding obvious, fish move around and many species don't stay in one place or one piece of habitat or one piece of structure day in, day out. They move around and they have places where they go to feed, where they know there's going to be food. They have places where they go to rest, and then they have transitional areas that they pass through on their way to feed or to rest. And of course, they also have migratory patterns on a larger scale. You know, if you're talking about over weeks or months, a lot of species will migrate for spawning or feeding or whatever. So they have these migratory patterns, but they also have daily patterns and habits and things that can help you to understand where they're going to be at a particular time. Give an example, bass fishing in impoundments or Murray cod fishing in impoundments for that matter. A lot of people are aware that first thing in the morning, last thing in the afternoon, they're great times to fish around the margins of a lake with topwater lures. Often those species will be hitting things on the surface in the shallow water early in the day and late in the day, and through the rest of the day, they might migrate to a thermocline, they might migrate to a deeper piece of structure, they might migrate to a weed bed, and that's where they spend the rest of their day, either resting up or feeding. And by understanding where they're going to be at a particular time of day, or a particular phase of the tide for that matter, and what they're going to be doing and how they're going to be behaving, that can help you to catch some fish. Now, it's really obvious, fish are moving onto flats, for example, to feed. They're moving up as the current comes up. They're coming into those areas where there are baitfish, where there are crustaceans or whatever. They're doing that to feed. And so that's a really obvious one. If you know a feeding zone and you know what conditions favour feeding in that zone, then you can make sure that you're there when the fish are up in that area feeding. But I think a big mistake people make is they don't recognise that the fish actually have places where they go to rest as well. And Murray cod's a good example of this, but I'm going to use jewfish. It's another good example of this. So I hear people say quite often, I do pretty well on the dewies when they're up feeding on the flats, when they're in the shallow water, when the tide's pushing up or they're ambushing bait that's being washed off a sandbank or something like that. I do pretty well on the dewies, but I see them all the time on the sounder down around the bridge pylons in a deep hole, and I find them very hard to catch there. Well, that may be because when they're up in those shallow areas, they're up there to feed. You know that they're there because there's bait being brought down by the current, so you know that they're ambushing that bait. When they're in the deep hole by the bridge pylon, they might actually not be feeding, they might be resting up. And so you'll hear people say, they're shut down. When they're up near the bridge, they're always shut down, can't catch them there. But no, they're not shut down. They're just not actively feeding, which means you need to understand what it is that you need to do to trigger a bite. And it might mean that you've got to use a soft vibe, and you've got to get it right down in front of their faces, and you've got to work it slowly, and you've got to coax them or annoy them or tease them until they take that lure. Where on the flats, they might be actively feeding, and anything you swim past them is going to get that reaction bite. So being able to understand and observe where fish feed and where fish rest and modify your technique based on that. That's a really good skill to have. And also understanding those transitional zones. So, for example, you might know that fish move through a channel to come up onto the flats as the tide's coming in, and then they recede back through that channel as the tide's going out. So there's that transitional zone. The fish may be actively feeding in there. They may not be. They may have already had a feed. I don't know about you, but when I've had a big feed, the last thing I want to do is eat something else. I want to go and rest up, sleep it off. You know, maybe if you tease me enough with an after dinner mint or a chocolate, I might take that. But, you know, typically fish that have fed are going to go and digest that food for a while, and they're going to rest up. Now, if you're thinking about species like, I don't know, tailor or Australian salmon or tuna, they probably do that a little bit less. You generally find there's a school of fish, they have to be a bit more competitive. They tend to eat when there's the opportunity to eat because they're competing with a whole bunch of schoolmates. And you probably find that more often than not, there are fish within that school that are going to be feeding, but still, that you'll find times where you have large schools of fish that are moving around and seemingly are completely uninterested in anything you throw at them. And I would wager that's because they've had a big feed on a school of baitfish and they're just now digesting that feed before they go and feed again. So understand where fish feed, where they sleep, and how they transition in between, and look for those areas. So look for known feeding areas. You can do this again on Google Earth. You can do this on Navionics before you leave home. Once you're out on the water, use your eyes to observe. Are there fish feeding there? If not, where are they? And those highways, you know, I've said already, look at the edges. Also, gaps through weed beds and that sort of thing. Gaps through reefs, channels through reef and weed bed. They're also highways where fish obviously transition from one zone to another, whether it's a feeding zone to a sleeping zone or vice versa, or maybe from one feeding zone to another, who knows. But those transitional areas, can give away a fair bit, and you might observe fish moving through there at particular times or particular phases of the tide, and that gives you some pretty good clues about what they're up to. So folks, that rounds out my 10 indicators, non-sonar largely. There's a few sonar ones mixed in, but the 10 indicators that will help you to decide where fish are going to be, or to help you to decide when you're on the water if you're fishing in the right place. Let me just go through them from the top, just give you a quick refresher to recap. So bait, look for bait. Is the bait worried? Is it being pursued by predators or not? Number 2 was birds, not just diving seabirds, but even in freshwater areas, looking for pelicans, cormorants, wading birds, and sea eagles. Number 3 was turtles and dugongs. So if you're fishing coastal areas, particularly in northern Australia, signs of life, reptilian life, is also an indication that you're in a productive area that probably holds fish. Number 4 was crocodiles. Again, for the northerners, anywhere where there's crocodiles, you know that they feed on barra, they feed on threadfin salmon and other species as well. But you know if there's crocodiles around, there's going to be fish nearby. Number 5, sharks and dolphins. Exactly the same philosophy. Sharks and dolphins put themselves where they've got a good chance of getting a feed. If you're seeing sharks and dolphins, you know there are going to be fish around. Of course, you do have that issue with having your fish taken by sharks, the old taxman coming along and taking his share. So make sure that you fish sustainably, and if the sharks start becoming a problem, you move to another spot. Number 6 is looking at the health of the ecosystem. Anytime you find a place where there's an abundance of life, a diversity of life above the water and in the water, it's likely that there's going to be predatory fish there to feed and to target. Number 7 was currents and structure. Remember that currents bring oxygenated water, they bring food, and they make life comfortable for the fish, but only if there's pieces of structure there as well. So look for those signs that there are currents and structure interacting, ripples, eddies, current lines, flotsam and jetsam, all those sorts of things. Number 8 was water quality and water colour in particular. So look for places where there are changes in water quality and changes in water colour, because fish will often hunt in those areas. Number 9 was edges. Edges of weed banks, edges of sandbeds, edges of anything, channel drop-offs, anywhere where there's a transitional zone, the edges of reefs and rubble patches, there's always going to be fish on those edges. They just love them. They use them for navigation. They use them for feeding. And number 10 was homes and highways. So understand that fish don't always feed 24/7. They do have places where they like to feed, and they have places where they like to rest, and be able to recognize which one you're fishing in and adjust your techniques accordingly. So there you go, 10 indicators or 10 factors that can affect whether or not you're fishing in the right spot. I hope you found it useful. And folks, of course, I will put some show notes together on the ALF website. I do apologise. It's been a very crazy time and the website is a little bit behind, but I will get some show notes for this episode up in due course. And I will try and catch up on the backlog of ALF podcast show notes to get up there as well. But go and check it out, episode 495, doclures.com, and you'll find, hopefully, a PDF and an MP3 you can download there. Now, we are creeping up towards the 500th episode. Thank you so much to everybody who gave me some feedback on their favourite episode. I'm just compiling the 500th episode as we speak. It's going to be a great one. We've got some big announcements to make as well for the 500th. It's going to be a little bit of an event, and I'm really looking forward to it. But the submissions for the 500th episode are now closed, of course, to give me time to prepare the episode and put something really cool together. And folks, going on from episode 500 onwards, some really, really cool and exciting stuff in the pipeline. So definitely stick around to find out what's going to be going down in the next few weeks. So that's it for episode 495. Folks, enjoy your Friday. Enjoy the weekend ahead. If you're getting out for a fish, please be safe, tight lines, and I look forward to seeing you out on the water. Bye for now.
Don't miss a single episode of ALF. Subscribe and rate us on iTunes or jump on the doclures.com website for downloads and show notes. Till their next episode, tight lines.